Welcome to another episode of Making the Metaverse, your weekly deep dive into the new and exciting world of Web3. This week, we have a fascinating discussion lined up for you where we will be taking a deep dive into the future of payments in the Web3 space.
Now, when you think about the real-world application of blockchain technology, then you cannot look past payments as the first real use case. Despite recent setbacks, we are seeing huge excitement and development around DeFi. However, there are still huge challenges to overcome to reach mass adoption.
So what are these new challenges and opportunities that lay in front of us to actually get to this exciting new world at scale? Well, we have the perfect man here to help us answer this burning question. Welcome, Nabil Manji, who is head of crypto and Web3 at Worldpay from FIS.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. Excited to be here.
Likewise. And super excited to kind of get some of your insights. We want to, I suppose, open with the first question around getting to know you, the audience. Can you explain your history? How did you get into the position of being a Web3 enthusiast and a leader in this space? And where are Worldpay and FIS now, the state of Web3?
Sure. Yeah, so my background's not that interesting, to be honest with you. I've got a pretty standard background. Started my career in generalist management consulting and then went to go work at an investment company in the US. And at the investment firm I was at, we used to do a lot of investing in enterprise software companies. And while I was there, which was in the 2016, 2017, 2018 timeframe, we came across a few investment opportunities that were companies building things on the blockchain. And so I actually learned about Ethereum before I learned about Bitcoin. And I thought, hey, this is kind of interesting. I grew up playing a lot of video games. And so the thought of like a digitally native form of money that was peer-to-peer in nature was instantly appealing to me. And then having, been in business for a few years, the thought of programmable money and smart contracts was also super interesting. So after becoming exposed to it and also learning about it from a few friends who I discovered were quite into it, I decided to kind of take my career towards crypto. And as you said in the intro, whenever you Google crypto or blockchain, one of the first things you'll read about from a use case perspective is payments. And so that's what led me to Worldpay from FIS, was kind of wanting exposure to crypto, but also being able to do it, in a big market and at a large company. And a lot of people don't know about Worldpay from FIS. I actually say it's probably the largest company you've never heard of. We actually provide software, technology, infrastructure, business process outsourcing, services, et cetera, to most of the banks and capital markets institutions and large merchants around the world. So Worldpay in particular is the world's largest payment processor. And a lot of people don't realize this, but when you go into a store or buy something online, that store or that merchant, as we call it, doesn't actually have a direct relationship with Visa and MasterCard. Visa and MasterCard are essentially networks. And payment processors like Worldpay give companies access to those networks. So every company that you buy something from is working with a payments company like Worldpay from FIS. And today, we have the privilege of supporting over 1.5 million clients around the world, processing over $2 trillion a year in all sorts of different currencies, all sorts of different payment methods, and also had the privilege of being the first large payment processor to enter the crypto space all the way back in 2015.
Nice. Here at Social Tree, we are firm believers we're in the midst of a financial revolution,
Absolutely.
A brand new kind of financial institution being made, similar to after World War II, when you had the IMF and the World Bank.
Yeah.
And now we've got this new financial infrastructure that's being built and so many great minds in the space building this out.
Yep.
And it would be great to hear from you about how you're kind of seeing Web3 in the metaverse. How do you kind of define it, or how are you kind of viewing the landscape as a whole?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because I think everybody you ask will give you a different answer.
Yeah.
And I think it's good to start actually looking backwards a bit. So if you think about Web 1, I view that as kind of a read-only universe. You would go on the internet, you could read news, you could digest content, but there was very little user-generated content. Social media didn't exist. Blogs didn't exist. It was really, you go on the internet, you research something, you look for whatever you were looking for, and then you log off. That was it, right? Then we have Web 2, which is really read and write. So now we have social media, we have blogs, we have people posting content and sharing content and all that. But you don't really own that content per se. Other companies are monetizing that content that you're generating, right? With advertisements or whatever it might be. And so Web 3 to me is really this next generation where it's read, write, and own. Now that's a pretty novel concept, because how do you own your social media posts, or how do you own or monetize your blogs? It's really difficult to do today. The other piece of it, I think, is most people, or at least the folks in the crypto space, will say Web 3 is basically taking Web 2, adding the ownership piece, and using blockchain as the technology or infrastructure layer to do that. So that's what a lot of people, as you said, are working on and kind of bringing into reality. I think we're in early days, and change in the internet, as we've seen, takes 10 to 15 years minimum for those kind of like Web 1 to Web 2. And then change when you talk about financial services, which is a key piece of ownership. Everyone knows that financial services move slow. So I think we're kind of at the beginning, as you said, of like a financial revolution, and what that looks like, 5-10 years from now, your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah.
But I think some of those themes around, ownership of content, blockchain being a technology layer, monetization and financial services being entwined with that, that's what we're going to see.
I think, to all the audience who are watching, you can, feel free to contribute to conversation and ask your own questions. But from listening to you speak, I think there's so much to unpack, and I think you hit the nail on the head. From my perspective, is when we talk about the future of Web3, I think you can't look past the first real application of Web3 technology, and that is really payments and blockchain. I think they're literally, you're in the eye of the storm, so to speak, about actual real world application of blockchain technology. So casting, I suppose, our eyes into the future, could you kind of lay out what the, I suppose, at least the medium term landscape of what the future will look like in terms of payments, and what kind of environments do you anticipate users kind of interacting with day to day in 5-10 years time?
Oh, that's a lot.
It's a big question to unpack.
I think, to answer that, it's important to understand how payments work today, so that we can kind of compare or like project into the future. So another thing, a lot of people don't realize as well is when you make a purchase, whether you're in person, tapping your card or typing in your PIN or whatever it is, or online, in the 2 or 3 seconds that it says processing, there's anywhere from like 4 to 8 different companies involved in that 3-second processing. You've obviously got the payment processor, which is what we do. You've got Visa and MasterCard, which are the major payment networks. You've got your bank, who may have given you your card or your e-wallet or whatever it is. The merchant might be using an anti-fraud solution. They may be using a third party to connect to the payment processor like us. So just in there, we're already at 5 or 6. If it's a cross-currency transaction, there's probably some foreign exchange provider. So now we're up to 7. So the reason I share all this is to say payments is complex. There's a lot of different parties involved. There are a lot of different roles being performed. And it's worked for what the world is trying to do today. Like cross-border e-commerce, generally speaking, is fairly seamless, all things considered. But I think if you look at a payment system and we're going to design it from scratch, you wouldn't design it how today's payment system looks, right? Like it's just evolved from, little incremental improvements over time. And I think the future utopia, if we use that word, is all direct peer-to-peer payments over one network. But that's never going to happen. You're never going to get the world, whether it's consumers or companies or other parties, to agree on one single network to use. Never going to happen. Countries will have their own vested interest in having their own networks with their own controls, all that sort of stuff. And so what I think we're going to see is a couple things. One is digitization of money, like fully. Like I don't think we're going to have physical currency around, if you project super far into the future. And then I think what you're going to see is new technology layers that fully replace the current system today. That's a pretty big statement to say, but again, most of the payment infrastructure that the world operates on hasn't changed that much since the 60s or 70s. So I think if you take this concept of digital money, new networks, I think the third big concept is going to be kind of more consumer control over their own kind of financial ecosystem or services. I think today, we have to rely on a lot of third parties like a bank or a credit card company or an e-wallet to transact. I think if there is a future world where there is a few different networks that can hopefully operate together, consumers can choose how they interact with those networks, what products they want to build or use or whatever. And most of the networks that are kind of leading in that race today, they're all public, right? They're not owned by a company. Consumers or users of that network can help set the rules. So that's a lot. Like, that's a way different world than we live in today. But I think that is where at least the folks in the crypto and Web3 space see things going. And as you said, there's a lot of talent and a lot of money chasing that vision.
It's yeah, you've explained, I suppose that feels like the beautiful end goal to get there. And I think it's a really interesting point around, you made it, and you said it a couple of times now, about ownership.
Yeah.
So how do you, I suppose but in your wider position at Worldpay from FIS, how do you kind of view the idea of ownership in relation to payments? Could you kind of break down what that looks like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, today in the financial services ecosystem, you rely on third parties to basically custody your assets. So think about just cash, right? Most people don't keep cash under a mattress at home. That's risky. What if your house burns down?
Yeah.
What if a burglar comes in and takes like all your money, right? So most people wouldn't be comfortable, doing that in today's world. I don't think it makes sense. But if everything's digitized and people are able to build really innovative products to help you self-custody, which is a term that people in crypto will use, I think you're going to see a lot more people be comfortable with that. And so I think, again, this is a multi-decade journey, but some people call it the disintermediation of financial services.
Yeah.
Where, it's not just going to be banks or payments companies that are providing these things, but it will be any company and any person.
Yeah.
Another good kind of anecdote is, if you listen to Andreessen Horowitz, I think at their 2019 or 2018 investor summit, they said, today in the world, roughly 10% of companies are financial services companies. But if you fast forward a decade, like, every company is going to be a financial services company. So I think this next generation of infrastructure and consumer comfort with that infrastructure that allows them to have more control or more ownership over financial assets, that's going to be an area that all companies and all individuals can innovate in, not just financial service providers.
The idea of control and ownership is so exciting, and it's just such an exciting time to be involved in the space. And it's literally, like we said, like a financial revolution. And I think the current system, is broken. If you look at banks and governments, they're just infinitely printing money, and currencies are just being debased. And like, we need something new, because the current system, if it just goes on like this, we're going to end up nowhere fast. So I think crypto is such an exciting space. And then layered within that, you've got like NFTs, fractional ownership. Like, it's not just money, it's the idea of like digital assets as well. Like, it's so rich, the tapestry of it. But, obviously that's the kind of long-term macro future, which you've talked about, but there's so much stuff we have to do now to get it ready, like compliance and stuff like that. So I was wondering, in terms of like the short term, what are some of the key challenges that you're working on at Worldpay and you're seeing brands have to overcome to really start adopting, this technology?
Yeah, I think a couple different things, and I'll hit on your point. I think, the government angle, before I dive into that question, is really interesting, right? I'm not an economist, but there's really high inflation all over the world, and it is probably not unrelated to the fact that there was a lot of money printing or stimulus over the last few years. But I think on the government note, one thing that's interesting is, a lot of countries are looking at CBDCs, which is kind of a double-edged sword, because in one way, I said earlier, it's going to be really hard for companies or consumers or countries to agree on a network. Well, governments can kind of lead the charge in that way, right? If they pick a certain layer of infrastructure or a certain network to build their national digital currency on, that's obviously a huge vote of confidence in that network or that piece of technology, right? Which is good. I think that can drive forward some standardization and, let us take the next leap. On the flip side, I think it's also scary. How you spend money is probably one of the most personal pieces of information that a person has. Yeah. And most people probably don't know with full visibility anybody else's like full spending habits, even your spouse. You don't know exactly what they're doing, right? So I think this whole concept of CBDC and government kind of nominated or chosen infrastructure is good from a technology innovation perspective, but it's also like very tricky from a privacy perspective. If the government knows exactly what you're spending your money on 24/7, 365, that's kind of scary. If they can program money to drive certain behavior, that can be good. It can help prevent fraud, but it's also kind of scary, right? So I think where I'm going with this is to answer your question, what's going to happen like in the medium term, like what are companies working on? I think right now there's a lot of experimentation going on with different networks, different, protocols as people call it, different wallet solutions, different digital currencies, different use cases, et cetera. I'm hoping over the next few years, we see some winners in some of those core technologies. And then the second wave of questions that's going to come up, and it's probably going to be a bigger challenge, is how do you make all those technologies interoperate? So that's the concept of interoperability. Because we're going to have a lot of different blockchains in the future with a lot of different currencies, with a lot of different applications. They need to be able to work together, just like how the SWIFT network, for example, has tied together the world's banks.
So it's a couple of things. I completely agree with you about the CBDCs being equally fascinating in terms of the utility, but on the flip side, terrifying. I think the idea that you can program money to promote behaviors, you could have very specific tax systems, you could have unique, but as you said, I mean, a future in which your money is essentially being able to, you could limit what you spend money on as well. You could, it's a government say you're not allowed to spend money on this product, and everyone stops. So I suppose it's tempering. And the second point around interoperability, it feels like you're saying that really you kind of need to have some kind of agreement, whether it's through CBDCs or some kind of leading the charge to standardize payment infrastructure, whilst also acknowledging that there should be some tempered expectations around how far that infrastructure can really be developed, particularly when you're looking at things like CBDCs. Do you think that interoperability, I suppose, this journey will be won through the best technology, or do you think it's going to be more around whoever has the biggest stick?
Probably a bit of both. Right. I think it's definitely going to be the latter, like big companies or governments or, whatever those big entities are and which technologies they gravitate to will definitely drive market behavior. But, they should be incentivized to choose the best technology for whatever use case they're developing, especially if they want to deliver it at scale to make them a big stick, so to speak. And then just, to go back to the privacy point, which I think is going to be a huge debate over the next decade, privacy and financial services. I think there's a lot of like really good use cases for programmable money. So for example, we've seen as a result of a lot of these stimulus programs in the US and UK and Europe, a lot of that money was misspent. Maybe it went to companies that shouldn't have received it. Maybe those companies spent it on things that they weren't supposed to. Exactly. Right. There's been a lot of stories in the news. The fraud's probably in the billions. If you had programmable money, you could have said it's only able to be received by, these entities, and these entities can only spend it on categories X, Y, and Z of goods. That's a good concept. I think most people would agree with that. But to do that, the government has to have visibility and control, which means there's a reduction in privacy and freedom. And it's a bit cliche to say, but like privacy and freedom come at a cost. And maybe some of that cost is misuse of, public money or private money or whatever it is, right? And so it's almost like a societal question. It's like, is that acceptable cost in exchange for like the benefits of privacy and freedom that I get in today's monetary system?
And that's why I think like, obviously decentralized networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum are so important as a hedge against the government's, programming money. At least you've got some sort of somewhere you can turn if things get dark.
This argument is playing out literally in real time as we speak. I think most folks in the crypto space and probably the broader financial services space will have read about the sanctioning of this software called Tornado Cash over the last month. And that's really interesting because Tornado Cash isn't a company. It's not a person. It's just a piece of open source code, right? And so literally yesterday, the CEO of Coinbase, Brian Armstrong, wrote a blog post announcing that Coinbase is funding a lawsuit against the US Treasury, saying that, the Treasury and OFAC have overstepped their authority because if you read the letter of the law, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't
Cliff notes.
fully know what I'm talking about. My understanding is that it says OFAC and the Treasury only have the power to sanction entities and individuals. You can't sanction software. Right. And there was some stuff going on in Tornado Cash that most people would find objectionable or illegal. But there was also a lot of very good behavior. People donating money anonymously, all that sort of stuff. So again, how do you balance the right and wrong there?
Well, there's a ton of questions coming. I think the CBDC topic definitely. And apology, in my advancing years and blindness, I have to pull my laptop very close to me. So there's a couple of questions which I'll run through. So there's a lot of stuff coming in around debasement of currency. But there's a question here from Justin, which is quite interesting, around how will open banking and PISP platforms have an impact on Web3 for card payments?
That's a good question. Open banking and PISPs have been around for a while. And the reality is that at least if you look at the UK, I think open banking payments only make up like 3 to 5% of overall payments. And it's been around for years. So I think, to me, that illustrates that payments and habits around payments are very hard to change. We've all gotten so used to just defaulting to cards in most parts of the world. And so I think, these payment methods, whether it's cards or open banking, et cetera, it almost doesn't matter, right? Like if I want to make a purchase, most merchants today, and I think this will be true of Web3 merchants, will accept those primary payment methods. But what I do think is going to happen in that utopian future, if you believe what a lot of the people in the crypto space believe, is that those payment methods are going to become kind of irrelevant because we're going to have a new set of infrastructure, a new set of currencies, et cetera.
Yeah, I could definitely echo what you're saying about changing behaviors. Like, my father-in-law, he's 70 years old. He just figured out how to use like a card. He actually was one of the guys who was keeping cash in his house. And now he's being told that, there's this thing called cryptocurrencies and stuff. Like,
it's kind of like
behaviors take time.
One thing I think a lot about, which is just really abstract when it comes to payments and money, is, today in the world, we can choose almost anything when it comes to choices or like decisions in life. We can choose where we want to live. We can choose what kind of car we want to drive. We can choose our clothes. We can get tattoos. We cannot. But we can't really choose what currency we want to use. It's kind of dictated by what country we're in, or like what the government has regulated, or what the merchant's willing to accept. So this whole notion of like, not only can I choose like my payment method, but can I choose like which currency I want to live my life in?
Yeah.
That's not really something that we can do today.
In many ways, that would go against the dollar-based system or fiat-backed system, which the US has backed and uses military might to enforce. So in many ways, is that question even going to be allowed to be had for citizens?
Who knows?
So there was a question actually really good from Chandy talking about is security tech keeping pace to increase consumer confidence in crypto or digital currency until further legitimization? Which is a really good question around
that. Is a really good question. I will be honest and say I'm not like a cybersecurity expert. Just like I'm not an economist, I'm not a lawyer. I do think that there is a valid narrative surrounding hacks and cybersecurity incidents in the crypto space, and I do think to have consumers have confidence in digital currencies and applications built on top of blockchain where money is involved, that narrative cannot be allowed to continue to permeate. And so I think this is something that we think a lot about as FIS, obviously as a critical infrastructure provider for financial services. Cybersecurity is top of our agenda. It's a topic we care a lot about. A lot of our clients in the crypto space as well, this is something they take very seriously, but I think there's work to be done. And if somebody tries to convince you otherwise, they're probably a bit delusional.
Yeah, but cybersecurity touches every industry.
Exactly.
It's not like it's unique to crypto,
right?
And there's just so many.
But I think there's a heightened sensitivity when it touches money, right? Because money is so personal.
Yeah. Also, issues obviously around stable coins and confidence in stable coins are a massive one as well. So there are massive, I think, barriers that we need to overcome to obviously reach mass adoption. But
definitely.
There's a question from Dean as well. Do you think we see 2 or 3 worldwide banking networks, and like mobile networks, people can then choose, or third parties can use their rails?
Yeah, I think that's going to be kind of the way of the future. I don't know if it's going to be 2 or 3 or 20 or 30.
Yeah.
Your guess is as good as mine when it comes to that front. But I think when it comes to, again, choice of currency, choice of network, that's all going to be driven by the quality of those networks, the coverage, the economics, the products built on top, which, yeah, mobile networks is a good kind of parallel to draw.
And there's a massive question, which is probably, I mean, it's literally your whole career or the whole job. How do merchants migrate from Web 2 to Web 3? I mean, that's a whole different that's a whole different live stream. But,
I think first, like the financial infrastructure needs to migrate, right? And I think it depends what you mean by Web3. I think if you're talking about financial services and money and payments like we have been for most of this, I think, yeah, the infrastructure with the confidence around things like cybersecurity, et cetera, and the actual scale to warrant adoption and, the efficiency when it comes to cost and all that, that all needs to play out, and that is going to take years, right? So I wouldn't be advising clients to like charge headfirst into digital currency payments right now,
right.
But what I do think is interesting is to start to think about what sort of products and services can I build on top of blockchain, where my consumers can still pay for it using a traditional payment method, but it starts to get me as an organization familiar with the technology, familiar with transacting in digital assets. And I think a really interesting example of this is what Nike's been doing with NFTs. For the record, I think, a lot of the NFT market is a bubble. It's hype. Like, everyone's just creating all this random art. But I do think some of these use cases where an NFT is linked to like a physical collectible or limited edition item or whatever it might be is super interesting. And Nike in particular, they announced this, I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks ago. They've made $190 million in net revenue off of, their NFTs. And like half of that was royalty revenue, where they get a little percentage every time a consumer resells the NFT. Now, if I'm a consumer goods company or selling a consumer facing product and I can get a royalty every time somebody trades it, I would see dollar signs like flashing in my eyes, right? Like imagine if Apple got a proportion every time somebody resold an iPhone or a MacBook.
Yeah.
That would be huge money.
Yeah.
Right.
NFTs are just so exciting.
Yeah. And they allow you to program that automatically, right? You don't need to have an army of people in an Apple, call center or operations warehouse tracking every MacBook and where it's registered and has it changed hands, and if so, for how much, right? You don't need that. What you need is an NFT that's tied to that specific device where maybe they can't use that device unless they can prove ownership of that NFT, such that you need to buy the NFT with the device because one without the other is useless. And then it's automatically programmed into that, like, hey, Apple gets X% of whatever that transaction value is.
It's a whole new category that's been invented, and it's just so exciting to see how generations will play with this. Like, the next generations coming up, like the Gen Zs, and they're going to be able to have stakes in brands and influencers, and they'll have like 10, 20, 100 NFTs, all with perhaps royalties. And the idea that you'd have your own portfolios, which are just not traditional to it won't be like NASDAQ. Well, they might have, and that's something on the NASDAQ, but it can be like the way you could invest and get money and be on a smart contract as well as cryptocurrencies is just, it's insane. It's like so exciting, the possibilities.
I mean, governments have kind of figured this stuff out, right? Like if you look in the US, in most places, if you buy like a car or a boat, every single subsequent purchaser has to pay sales tax on it.
Yeah.
Not just the original buyer. Or think about stamp duty in the UK.
Yeah.
The house isn't just taxed the first time it's sold, it's taxed every time it's sold.
Exactly.
It's like the governments have figured this out. It's like it's a very lucrative revenue stream, but companies haven't really.
Yeah. Opens the way up for like fractional ownership as well. Like maybe in the future, if you want to build like a real estate project, you could open up through NFTs. And I've seen art projects where you can fractionalize the art as well, and just through NFTs.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I think like if you look at a lot of different asset classes, whether it's art or, fine jewelry or watches or wine or whiskey, like a lot of those assets have outperformed, traditional equities or debt over the last decade. And right now, unless you're a person of means, it's very difficult to invest. Like art, for example, is very expensive, or at least quality art. So yeah, I think fractionalized ownership is super interesting. And like any new asset class, it's going to take a decade or more to like really take off. But I mean, speaking personally, and again, I'm not an investment advisor, like with what's going on in the current equity markets and what's going on with inflation and, the impact that's having on debt markets, et cetera. Yeah, I put some money in, some exotic assets or whatever.
Not financial advice.
Not financial advice.
No, you're complete. But I think it is, there are, of course, speculative bubbles and all emerging technologies.
Yeah.
There are, of course, nefarious actors. This is not a utopia, but just the other day I was speaking to my wife about how you wouldn't need in the future Versace could print or could create an NFT of a luxury good and have that NFT aligned to that particular item of clothing.
Yep.
Which would mean that you wouldn't need to have this at the moment. When she sells something secondary market, she has to go to a middle party who verifies that it's a real result. You won't need that in the future.
Yeah.
And I think there's so many exciting applications which are coming down, but we have to get over a big period of regulatory and uncertainty. And we've run out of time actually, but I think I wanted to ask. I think there's one last question.
Sure.
If I get your insights from. Which was a question from Arvin saying, are there any learnings from India's payments ecosystem? Are there any learnings from India's payments ecosystem? How NPCI has transformed the payments ecosystem?
Yeah, I think definitely. So India rolled out this new payment method driven heavily by the government called UPI. I think it was 4 years ago. In that span of time, it's gone on to represent, I think, close to a third, if not more, of India's total payments volume. Now, that's insane growth for a payment method when you think about the size of a country like India. And compared to what we talked about with open banking, a few minutes ago, where it's been around for way longer than that and is an order of magnitude smaller in terms of market share. And so I think what that demonstrates to me and kind of ties in nicely with what we were talking about earlier is the ability of government to actually drive innovation and adoption of a new technology or new product or service, whether it's a payment method or something else. And so to me, as I think about what are the networks of the future going to be, I really do think governments, for better or worse, are going to drive some of what that looks like. And I think UPI is a really good example of their ability to do so.
Oh, thank you, Nabil, for taking the time to chat today. And lots of people are saying they want a part 2. They want a part 3. So Nabil, I'm sure we'll do this again. Thank you so much for taking your time to chat to us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If people want to stay up to date with you, what's the best way of people connecting with you to keep in touch with your thoughts?
Yeah, LinkedIn is great. We're working with you guys to do some more content and some more sessions. I also speak at a lot of crypto conferences. So if you guys are ever at any conferences and want to meet up, I'll be at Token 2049 in Singapore, Money 2020 in Vegas. So you can come and find me and say hello.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining another live stream. We'll be back in a few weeks' time for another episode. So have a great afternoon.